Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 3. We are talking about some very big social and technological changes in the 1920s and 1930s. We're actually starting out in the teens. We'll be talking about some groups that were able to get some recordings in even before these vast changes. But let's talk about what's happening in the world in the 1920s and 1930s as we begin to understand the role of music in society at this time. In the 1920s is really when cars, telephones, phonographs, and radios become kind of part of people's daily lives. Before then, it was kind of the novelty. If you can think of a technology today that's really expensive that you can't afford, really phonographs and radios were like that at the very beginning, of course, of the technology. And as the 20s and 30s roll around, we see that they become more affordable for the general public, especially radio. Radio becomes widespread all the way across the nation, whereas before it was in kind of these small centers as they were trying to figure out how to make it work. And then it became a way to get information out across the entire nation. So it became nationwide, and of course it made a lot of musicians really famous. So the phonograph became super important because rather than sheet music, now these artists are using the phonograph and the radio to get their music out, and this is how they became really popular. This is the time of more organized crime. I actually teach a class at College of the Desert called The History of Film Music, which is super interesting to me. It's probably my favorite class. But we watched The Godfather, which is in the 1940s, but it's coming right out of this era. It's the time when we are beginning to see kind of an underworld really beginning to take shape. Especially with the advent of Prohibition. Prohibition made a lot of money for the gangsters because people still wanted to have a way to escape their lives through alcohol, and with it not being possible through law, it became unlawful, and organized crime really was able to catch a foothold there because of that. Now, I already talked about how technology would be changing the way we hear and buy music. No longer is sheet music the most important role in disseminating music throughout society. Now it would actually be the phonograph and the radio. The other interesting thing that happens at this time, World War I and World War II, we actually have the Armed Forces Radio, which is, of course, entertaining the troops on their time off. And so these artists become really popular to those that are serving in World War I, and then we'll find later in World War II. Electric recording happens. Now, you guys might be wondering, what's the big deal? But before electric recording and the microphone, let me show you a picture of what orchestras had to do to actually record themselves. And here's this picture. You have this big horn thing that is recording the entire orchestra. Here we have the cellist, and I guess the brass players back here. They pretty much left those guys alone. He's sitting on the floor because they're louder. But they had anyone that would be quiet up close to the microphone and those that were louder farther away. And so this little horn here was capturing all of the sound for the entire orchestra. So when we actually got electric recording, they could use microphones, and that's when the crooners became really important. Here's Bing Crosby, and he actually has this very awesome looking microphone in front of him to kind of, tell everybody, hey, look, this is my sound, this is my voice, and I can capture this for you to enjoy. The other thing that's interesting about the electric recording, it led to this idea of crooning, which is why I put Bing Crosby up there to begin with. I actually love watching him. He had some really great movies from, say, the 1930s to the 1960s. So I really actually like watching his old movies. But the microphone allowed us to see singing in a whole new way, where rather than it's a guy standing in front of an orchestra, like we'll see with Al Jolson in a few minutes, these guys that had this electric microphone, it almost sounded like he was singing to you. So there was this sense of intimacy. Certainly Frank Sinatra, he's my absolute favorite, but I always feel like when Frank Sinatra sings that he's singing to me. And I really think it's the style and the way that they present themselves and the fact that now they can actually be in the front of the orchestra because the microphone gives them more range of possibilities. I already talked about the radio. 1920 is when we start to have the birth of commercial radios. And if you'll look here, by 1926, we have some very familiar faces. NBC, CBS, ABC. These were originally radio companies before they became television companies. And by the 1930s, we had sponsoring, of course that means commercials, and then DJs to get us from one tune to the next and provide entertainment. So we see by the 1930s that we're actually well into what would be the modern broadcasting regiment that we're so familiar with. With the advancement of film, we have the rise of the big singer also, not only through radio, but also through film. But what's interesting here in 1927, we have a film called The Jazz Singer. Now, at this time, the technology in film was still silent. They would have a phonograph or a live orchestra or a piano player that would kind of fill in the music. If you've ever seen a silent film, usually you hear a piano player and he's playing and playing and playing, and then we have the slide that gives us the conversation, and then he's playing. You would also have, if you had a lot of money, if you were in a larger area where people could afford an orchestra, you would actually have an orchestra, an in-house orchestra that would play. But when they would come to these musical numbers where the musician or the performer would be singing, they would have a phonograph of the performer's actual voice. So the first, what's called sound film, was a film called The Jazz Singer, and even though it looks absolutely perfect on what I'm about to show you, they would have a phonograph that would try to line up with the vocal imitation that's going on screen. He can't actually give you his actual voice because we're still in the silent film era. So they would use this phonograph to present his voice and then his singing voice during the times of songs. And that's actually what I'm going to show you right now. We have Al Jolson. This is the first, I gotta get to the right place. This is the first, what they call talkie film, because even though it's on a phonograph, he's actually speaking before he begins singing, and that's what we see here. And this is Al Jolson, one of the most famous crooners, Broadway stars, film stars of the early era.
Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Good Me? All right, hold on. Look, listen. Play Good Me. 3 choruses, you understand? In the third chorus, I whistle. Now give it them hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Goodbye. Don't cry. Tell the future's rain. That takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then ow. You ain't over again. Fight for the mail. I never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey. Don't cry, Trixie, don't cry. Kiss me, Trixie, goodbye.
So there we have Al Jolson singing, and really pretty soon after this, 1929, 1930 is when we actually get into real sound films where they are actually have the technology to combine sound and the visual at the same time. But that's considered the first talkie film, and we'll talk more about Al Jolson in a few minutes. This is also the first foray into copywriting for live events, and they call that actually royalties. So if you have a live performance now, you're actually being paid as the composer of the piece of music, that you're going to get a little extra something for actually performing live rather than just sheet music. So ASCAP is what really delves into this role of live music. Before that, it was really only copywriting for printed music. So because of this, and they knew that they were going to have to pay out a little bit for each live performance, recording companies and publishing companies really began to limit the music to the public, and they only gave to us what they believed to be a commercially saleable item. And so hence we have like kind of the nest egg, or the growing of the commercial music industry that we see now. Especially, it probably really gains its foothold in the 1980s when MTV comes around. But we begin to see the rise of this, what is commercially saleable to the public, because they have to make sure that they're making their bottom line. And this really comes through the beginnings of ASCAP, which is the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, and it began in 1914. As we move along into the 1920s, the cabaret dance band, the early jazz bands, became so popular because of dance. Dance became a huge craze. Almost everybody danced in the 1920s. So the instrumentation that would have happened in this original cabaret dance band that kind of grew into the idea of the jazz band was violin, some brass instruments, some reed instruments, which have been saxophone, clarinet, a rhythm section, which have been a lot of different instruments. If it were Latin, it could have even been like the claves, or it could have been like snare drum, bass drum, cymbal, all of the things that would be associated with the drum set. And then we have a whole entire rhythm section beyond the drums of bass, banjo, guitar, and piano. So this type of band was open to requests, which is why dancing became so popular. People would come up and say, hey, I really want to do the tango, I really want to do the foxtrot, and they were open to requests. So it allowed us to have many different styles of dancing. And this is where I'm going to talk about Irene and Vernon Castle. They were probably the most important dance stars of the 1920s. And I know I have a picture of them. There they are. And what was interesting about Irene and Vernon Castle is they kind of brought dance to the public. I mean, me personally, I find dance to be really intimidating. I certainly would rather be in the orchestra playing the music for other people to dance than for me to be actually dancing out there myself. So it was, these people, Irene and Vernon Castle, were really interesting in that they simplified dance so that pretty much everybody felt like they could get out on the dance floor and do something simple. And I wanted to show you this picture of the Roaring Twenties. And these two pictures are so interesting because I really like this one because she is totally grooving on a dance, which was such a big deal. Everybody went out to go dancing. That was kind of the movies of today. Where everybody goes to see a movie on a first date. Back in the 20s, you probably would have had dinner and dancing. And this is another great picture of the fashion of the 1920s, where skirts got shorter so that women could dance more easily. And you can see a lot of them are wearing the Mary Janes that would have been popular as a dancing shoe at the time. Now, what I want to show you here is actually a newspaper article that features the Castles, and they are giving you this, what they call variations of modern dance. They're simplifying modern dances, and they actually have an entire handbook on how to approach dancing for the everyday person, and it's really the Castles that promoted this and allowed this to happen. And that's actually where I'm going to go into the story of James Reese Europe in the next video, which popularized these cabaret dance bands and jazz bands to allow people to come out and actually dance and have a great time. And it was the Castles that franchised themselves. They were actually one of the first franchise people ever. They had books, they had equipment, like in other words, they had like shoes and outfits, things that you could wear to actually go out dancing. And it was the castles that had kind of this first franchise agreement, one of the first ones in the U.S.